And we are ready. Oh, just a sec. Um, First of all, Elisa, thank you so much for doing this. It is an honor. We just had a conversation last night about the your last book, The Sixth Extinction and the Natural History. Well, trying to figure out what does it mean to like be human in the 21st century, and trying to live with this information. Tell us a little bit about. Well, first of all, I would like to know a little bit more about yourself. Uh, how did you came to this subject?
The subject of the sixth extinction?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do sort of tell the story at the beginning of the book. It's that's pretty honest. I wanted to write a piece about what was being called the Amphibian Crisis, and I did get National Geographic Kids, and that gave me this idea to do a piece from Panama, where they had built this facility to house amphibians that, as what's now known as BD, um, just swept through Central America. And at the same time, really almost exactly the same time, we started to get this story of the bat die off in the northeastern US. It's now spread, it's now also on the West Coast, not all across the US, but it's, in something like 33 states, something like that. And so those two stories kind of came together. I wrote a story that was titled "The Sixth Extinction" with a question mark for the New Yorker, and that was really the beginning of the book. It seemed to me that, wow, well, I mean, it wasn't. It's sort of, obviously, it wasn't like people hadn't written about the biodiversity crisis because clearly they had, but and people had also, put this in the context of previous mass extinctions, but it didn't seem to me that that story was widely known. And so that really is what set me on the path to writing The Sixth Extinction. I want to say it was a long slog. It took something like, it took almost 5 years to write the book. So it wasn't like just an immediately, I had the idea and I wrote it. Yeah, although I try not to even think about that anymore, because it was really, there were moments when that book was really hard to write.
To
I
to
gotta
be
say that. Oh, sorry, I
no,
was gonna
but
say I gotta say that one thing that I really like about the book is that you tell us both like the facts, but you tell it through the having interacted with the people trying to do something about it. So what did you learn from these efforts? Do these people, because they're giving away their lives to a cause that I'm not sure we can save it or not. I don't know what's your perspective on that. But what keep them going in such a difficult situation?
Well, I think that people had different motives, honestly. For some people, it was their life's work that had brought them, I mean, the book starts with a guy, Edgardo Griffith, who is really one of the people who is really on the ground in Panama, and is still on the ground in Panama, still running this facility where they house these amphibians that are not found in the wild anymore. So, just keeping them alive is sort of his life's work. I once again, it hasn't been easy, and I think I'm sure there were many times when he, wished he were doing something else, but that has turned out to sort of be his life's work. Then there were people who are much more academic. They just kind of, what they were studying was sort of disappearing, and this led them down an academic track. You guys are all, PhD students, so I'm sure you can relate to how that happens. Um, One of the women, for some people, some people worked in these captive breeding facilities. That was obviously their job on some level, and what kept them going, I think, was also very dicey. I mean, I'll tell, there's one story I tell in the book about the Sumatran Rhino, and a woman named Terry Roth, who I became, somewhat friendly with in the course of reporting the book. And that effort, subsequent to the book coming out, the rhino, who's sort of the main character, I guess, in that chapter, Suchi, died,
Mm.
and um, the last remaining Sumatran rhino in the U.S., who was her brother, was sent to Indonesia. He is now in Indonesia, and the hope is where really almost all the remaining Sumatran rhinos are there. That he will eventually sire a calf. I don't think that's happened yet, but she reached sort of the end of the line there. There was nothing left that she could do. And so I honestly don't even know what she's doing now, but you've sort of inspired me. I should send her an email, because she told me at that point, look, we can't continue this captive breeding ever. We don't have any more Sumatran rhinos. And I think it was very, very hard and painful for her, because she had really devoted, maybe a decade of her life to trying to figure out their reproductive physiology. And I think she probably still goes to Indonesia sometimes, maybe to sort of help out. I don't really know, but that was a big blow, to that. Can't can't do a captive breeding program when you don't have any rhinos.
Hmm. I gotta be honest, this was a really emotionally hard to read book, and I can only imagine how it was to write it. I would like to make the same question, but about you, like, how did it feel? I didn't know it was 5 years of research, and what kept you going through all this time?
Well, for better or worse, it's several years ago now. In part, what keeps you going is also, you know, partly what keeps all these people going, right? It's your job. You said you were going to write this book, and then you're kind of committed to writing the book. I mean, um, but that being said, also, it's a very heavy subject. I am the first person to say that. But in the course of writing the book, I had a lot of, so I consider some of those trips that I took to write the book absolutely highlights of my own life. Going to Panama, going to Australia to visit the Great Barrier Reef, going to Manaus, going into the Amazon. Those were just amazing experiences. So it was this kind of weird thing where, on the one hand, the subject matter was very depressing, and writing it was very hard. Not to be too self-pitying, but also there was a lot of fun, and a lot. I mean, just great adventures in the process of writing it that sort of made it this sort of seesaw experience.
Yeah, it must have been like a sweet and sour experience to
Yeah,
look at all this natural beauty and to know what's going to happen.
yeah, and I mean, the weird part of it was I did, in the process of writing the book, get to go to some of the still wildest places on earth. I mean, that the Amazon, to pretty as untouched as you can get these days. As a
And so another thing that I like about the book is that it's not like preachy of like, oh, but you guys keep on eating your burgers and look at what you're doing to this planet. Uh, but I wanted to ask you, I don't know how willing, given that you have compiled so much knowledge from different situations around the world, if you're willing to, if first, if it changed your own life, your own perspective, and your own actions on your day to day, like what could you change for yourself, and if you have been involved in trying to advise policies or trying to, your book is already enough awareness for society to know the severity of the situation. But I'm willing, if you're willing to take the next step and be like, and I think this is what we should do, kind of.
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, there are a lot of people, as you know, conservation biologists, and there's whole global, bodies set up to advise governments about what policies should be implemented. I do have, I do have certain views on it. I wouldn't say they're very sophisticated views, but I don't, I don't, the book doesn't lay out a bunch of policy prescriptions, and I don't really feel, I think, one of the messages of the book, unfortunately, for better or worse, is, all forms of change are potentially deleterious to other species. They just don't have the wherewithal to adapt to our latest, whatever it is. And so I guess the only message that I would offer, policymakers, if they ask me, and to be perfectly frank, they very rarely do, is, everything that we're thinking of doing, and this does sort of get into the latest book, but, everything we think of doing, including a lot of potential responses to climate change that have very large land use implications, for example, they raise questions for other species that are, not at all straightforward. It's not at all clear, what's worse for you as a resident of some forest or some savanna or whatever, if people decide to use that for, to plant trees where they're, planning to sequester carbon, rather than leaving it alone to for climate change to also wreak havoc. But there's a lot of trade-offs. They're not at all straightforward if you're a non-human species.
I wanted to say
most species are. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just gonna say that your book has this very characteristic style where instead of maybe throwing a bunch of statistics or data, you are telling these different stories in different chapters of different species that are being most hardly affected by these extinction trends. And I wanted to ask you if, what motivated you to write it that way? Was it because maybe you think that could move maybe people to be more aware of what's going on? And on the same side, do you think there's a role that you as a science writer may have in maybe creating more awareness or consciousness about these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sort of, technique of the book, which may, usually I write for the New Yorker, and a bunch of the book appeared in the New Yorker, before it appeared in the book. And so, that kind of very, the style of the book is very much a New Yorker style, and there aren't charts or diagrams because the New Yorker never runs charts or diagrams. I mean, there's some in the book, but very few. Because that's just, so everything is in words, you have to paint the picture in words. That's kind of just imported from the New Yorker in a way. But I do think that, look, there have been and will be hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of scientific papers that, make one or several of the points in the book, but they are just written, as you guys all know, they're written for other scientists. They're just not written for, you wouldn't get it published. If it was written in sort of plain, what I will call plain English, it wouldn't pass muster at a scientific journal. And so I think that the role that I sometimes describe myself as having is just a translator, just translating this scientific literature into language that people understood. And along the way, though, also, I do think it's important. And once again, you all who are writers of scientific papers know this. I think a lot of what we humans consider storytelling is drained out of scientific literature. There's no first person, there's no one doing the observing. There are the observations, but there's no actor doing the observing. There's no casual conversation. It's all just very scripted and dry and written in a way that most people A, couldn't read. They simply couldn't understand the language, and B, certainly wouldn't read. Not to mention that a lot of it's behind a paywall, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big role for people like me to play to try to bring that to a general audience, just using pretty conventional storytelling methods. I mean, there's nothing in the book that's like you wouldn't find in a lot of nonfiction writing. I go somewhere, I meet someone, I see something that you, the reader, don't have access to, and we go from there.
And I gotta say that, as a fan of reading these kind of books, I really admire your work and people like David Quammen and Carl Zimmer. Like, I just think that you guys are the very forefront. Just even for if I call myself a scientist, you're still bringing me so much knowledge in a much more digestible way, because the literature sometimes is even very hard for myself. So I think your role is not only important for the general audience, but even for the scientific community.
Well, thank you. And David Quammen is one of my absolute heroes. And have you all read The Song of the Dodo?
No, that's on my list, but we read last year Spillover.
Yes, Spillover is really good. Song of the Dodo predates Spillover by many years, and not many anyway, a decade or so. Anyway, it's one of my. It's a book that really changed my life, my way of looking at things. So I really recommend it. It's a really good book. Anyway, but that gets to this question, this point, sort of that scientists are writing, for each other, but they're also writing for a very, very specialized group, right? Like, so, you're working in one discipline and subdiscipline, and you're writing, your reviewers are going to be working in the same subdiscipline, and you're working for those people. You have to get it past those people, who are, and the guy in the next, or the woman in the next, Carol, she may be working on something totally different, and she won't be able to read your papers, so you guys are working in such a specialized world. And I think that I don't want to say that's a problem. Obviously, that's how science operates these days, but as I say, it does leave a lot of room for journalists to try to, as you say, even communicate between scientific subspecialties.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point, because like you say, in the scientific community, everything is in like a very technical language, and you kind of translate all those data knowledge and make it digestible to so many people. Yeah, that's really important. Actually, I was telling my mom about the book, and she thought the title was kind of, impactful, because it's the sixth extinction. We are provoking the sixth extinction. But she then asked me, well, what are the other 5 extinctions? And yeah, and then it's like kind of a difficult question to answer. So how, in a nutshell, how do you answer this question? Because I guess people have asked you that.
Well, there's that graph in the book that show, the famous graph from the 80s, I guess, that shows these what are called the big 5. I think I usually just tell people, well, you're familiar with mass extinction because we all know, most people do know about or have heard of the end Cretaceous extinction, and, we no longer have dinosaurs. And so something happened there. So that one is pretty well known. And then I think that the end Permian extinction, which is the third, which is sometimes called the mother of all mass extinctions, which was really, really a dire extinction event 250 million years ago. People are not familiar with that, I don't think, very much, but you can sort of point to that as a moment, a moment in the geological record where, a whole era came, the Paleozoic era came to an end. And so I sort of explain it that way, but some of them are a little bit, mysterious even, and we don't know exactly what caused them. And there's, debate over exactly whether they were extinction events or whether, some people have said that there were actually events where, and you guys might know more about this than I do, events that actually we got a sort of failure of speciation. So that led to this plunge in diversity even more than, it was actually an extinction event. So there's some murky ones in there, but the big ones are the Permian, as I said, and the end Cretaceous that we know a fair amount about.
And I guess I don't know if what's the real consensus. Like after reading your book and actually digging into some of the references that you point us to, I am convinced that this is the sixth one. But how widely accepted is it by the people working in this field?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that the problem here is obviously, comparing apples to oranges, right? So when we look at the big five, we're looking at the fossil record, and usually the marine fossil record, because that's what we have. And these events are pretty noticeable in those records. And then the question is, okay, what's the fossil record of the present going to look like? Well, that's really hard to know. So people have tried to compare apples to apples, and the results are usually pretty dire, to be honest. And there's a paper that I cite in the book, done by a guy named Anthony Barnofsky, who's at UC Berkeley, where they really tried to say, okay, let's look at the best studied group of organisms that we have, which are definitely vertebrates and, let's say, mammals, organisms that we feel confident are pretty well cataloged, and follow them through the IUCN classifications of threatened, vulnerable, threatened, critically endangered, blah, 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 how fast they're moving through those stages, and extrapolate from there. And that paper, which came out several years ago now, but that paper made the point, look, if these rates keep up for, somewhere between, let's say, 200 and 600 years, I can't remember what the exact figures are, then we would be reaching, end Cretaceous like levels of extinction among those groups. Right now we have a lot of groups that we don't study, can't make comparable calculations for, but that's extremely sobering. So I think there are a lot of paleontologists, I would say, who would say, well, by the time you're in a mass extinction, the whole world has collapsed, and so we're clearly not in a mass extinction yet. But I don't find that very heartening as that. I mean, at the point, and so I'm sure there's pushback in the paleontological community, but I don't think there's anyone who says we keep this up and we're going to cause a major extinction event. I think that's pretty. I don't want to speak for the paleontological community, but I think that's a fairly widespread sentiment these days. And people have said things to me, if you really want a chill to run down your spine, and one of them says it in the book, I think, we could be looking at one of the major events in life history, worse than the end Cretaceous. And that if that's not sobering, I don't know what is, because one of the things that I think people don't appreciate is how unusual what we're doing is. You all doubtless do, who study the history of life, but it's just not really a very common that anything can change. Any species or even geological event can change the planet at the rate and with the wide, global nature of the changes that we're causing.
I found this really enlightening because, we're used to living into like some sort of normality that is like our day-to-day life, but but to find out how unnatural it is, like compared to the whole history of life, it's just uh, I don't know. It's stunning. What has been like the response of the general public to this information?
Well, I mean, that's another good question. I mean, I think that the book, got a surprisingly good reception. I mean, I was surprised, and I know a lot of kids are compelled to read it in college these days and things like that. So I think it has. I like to think that it has helped bring the issue attention. But at the end of the day, has anything changed? Au contraire. Since the book was written, I could write many new chapters about many new species that have been officially or unofficially declared extinct. Just in the since that book was written 7 years ago or whatever. So the story, if I ever write a new edition or whatever, I mean, there are so many stories that I could write. It's grim. It's gruesome and grim, and a whole new, I mean, I don't really have a lot about insects in the book, but insects, as I'm sure you've all read, and there was just a paper yesterday in Science, I think it was in Science, about the butterflies of the Western U.S. crashing populations. So the beat goes on, and the news, certainly is. Let's just say it's not getting any better.
What do you think that is? That people can read this information and understand the issue and the gravity of the issue, and still don't make any noticeable changes in their lives?
Well, I think it's very, most of us live pretty removed from, any. Well, let me take it back. Most of us, live in highly altered environments. I live in a sort of semi-rural environment, but it's still a highly, highly altered environment. I don't know exactly where you all are sitting, but it's, probably a highly, highly altered environment. And so, what would you even do? People. So we feel very cut off from, let's just take deforestation in the Amazon. Now we are all driving it, as was alluded to, you go to McDonald's or wherever I don't know where they're getting their grain. I don't want to single out McDonald's, but you get the basic point,
Yeah.
It's the Amazon's being, cut down for soy, and that's, feeding animal livestock and so we all, but the links in the chain are so, and in some ways, and I don't want to, in some ways purposefully, right? It's purposefully obscure, and even the guy, or gal raising the, cattle on some other ranch who got the soy from the deforested Amazon, they don't know where it came from. It's all thrown together, and so the supply chains obscure what our relationship is to some of these really big drivers. And, and then climate change, everyone now is kind of increasingly aware that whatever they do is contributing to climate change. But does that mean that, I'm not going to take a shower? Does it mean I'm not going to, drive my kid to school? It's such a tenuous connection, and everyone is doing it. And so, what difference does it make if I have that burger? What difference does it make if I drive my kid to school? So I think it's very hard. And I completely empathize with everyone who says, what the hell can I do? I can give some money to the World Wildlife Fund or whatever, but should I give up the conveniences of modern life or whatever? Should I give up that trip to Paris because, I know somewhere that the aggregate impacts of this are disastrous. It's the tragedy of the common writ globally, I guess, on some level.
Yeah, that seems to be like the general attitude. We just spoke about this book last night, and we received a bunch of comments with the general idea of, oh, okay, why should I start the change when some bigger corporation isn't doing it first? Why should I do anything at all if everybody's not doing anything? Like, what would you say to those people?
Well, I would certainly say that as I say, I empathize, I understand, I know that I myself, there's a figure that a scientist that with whom I'm, somewhat friendly, came up with, like, every time you burn whatever, every time you emit a ton of CO2, which, all of us are doing here in the US every, month, or some horrible figure like that. Here's how much ice you're melting in the Arctic, right? You can take responsibility, for your cubic meter of ice. So I think that, if we could connect people maybe to their impacts more, they would maybe feel it more viscerally. But I do empathize with everyone who says, why should I give that up? Why should I be the one when no one else is doing it? The flip side of that, obviously, is, if everyone did it, if we all modeled better behavior, if we all did hold some of these big, huge global corporations accountable, then things would change. And I do think that, one of the sort of upsides, I guess, of social media, which I have mixed feelings, but is that we could use our collective voices more to put, we can communicate globally. People can find out what is in that bar of soap. Is that, palm oil that was unsustainably harvested? And so it is possible, but I have to say, it is a damn pain in the neck, right? I mean, are we all looking at every ingredient and going to the store? And so we need, and maybe it would be a good idea. You're giving me all sorts of ideas, but, there are, like, those groups that, they have a little thing, like, which fish should you eat? Which fishes are being sustainably fished, and you can pull it out of the supermarket. And we should probably have a list. You pull it out of the supermarket, like, don't buy this, don't buy that. And maybe that would have a big impact. These companies do respond to public pressure. Absolutely. Consumers have a lot of power, but we don't use it adequately. So that's a kind of rambling answer, but I understand why people feel that way, but I also think we could do a lot better.
Yeah, many people that are listening to us right now are very young, and I'm sure many of them want to do something about it, right? And there is no straight path like to take. Oh, I studied this and then I'll be helping the environment. So, like, what kind of advice would you give to these young people that want to, what careers should they pursue to do something about these issues?
Well, I really do take the view that almost anything you do, you can potentially make a difference, and that, even include, that does mean, but it does mean being willing to push back. I think that having people inside some of these big companies, it probably doesn't make you a popular person, but I think it's even, possible to work at some of, these big corporations that are responsible for a lot of, bad stuff, and to make a difference from wherever you are. So I don't feel there's, like, a career, look, obviously, getting into, land conservation or becoming a conservation biologist, that's, frontline, or, people working, really. And I know that there are a lot of people in Mexico who are really on the front lines of trying to protect landscapes and individual species. And that's actually, dangerous and really noble work. But, not all of us are going to be doing that. So anywhere you are, you have to think, what are what are my talents, and what can I contribute? And I think that almost anything you do, from medicine to marketing, you can have it push those around you and yourself and the whole enterprise to consider some of these questions, like how are we sourcing our materials? All of these questions need to be really honestly rethought from the ground up. Absolutely.
So one of the things that so we have had these book clubs with other authors, but this is the first time that we were reading a book that was translated into Spanish. And I wanted to ask you two things, like, how did that happen? And can we expect your new book to also be soon in Spanish?
How it happens is really uninteresting. It's some publishing house gets interested in it, Spanish speaking publishing. It's not, I have nothing to do with it. They just come to you and say, can we buy the translation rights? And you're like, sure. And so that's how it happened. And yes, the new book is being translated into Spanish. I don't know. I think it'll probably be out in the fall in Spanish. And I don't know exactly what I think I did get the title, but I can't remember exactly. I think it's a pretty fairly literal translation.
Yes, for the audience, what is the title of your new book?
The title of the new book is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future.
And what is it? And what is it about?
So the new book is about, it's sort of, in some ways it's a sequel to The Sixth Extinction. It is about all these ways that we've intervened in the natural world, what we'll call the natural world for lack of a better term, and now we don't like the results. In some cases it is species or ecosystems that are collapsing. What are we going to do about it? So I'll give you, for instance, at the center of the book is a story of a group of scientists working because, in climate change, and this comes up in The Sixth Extinction, coral reefs are one of those groups of organisms that really we know they don't like warmer water. We already see really a lot of damage to reefs. So in Australia and Hawaii, there are scientists who say, look, we're not getting that heat out of the oceans. That's just not doable in any foreseeable time frame. So if we want to have coral reefs in the year, a century from now, we're going to have to intervene again. We're going to have to basically tweak corals. We're going to have to either breed them up or potentially genetically manipulate them so they can survive in warmer water. Now that, as you can imagine, is a lot easier said than done. But that's sort of the idea that once you've intervened in one way, can you intervene again, to correct for that? And that's sort of the situation we're on, this sort of treadmill situation where, we've so altered the world that we're now in the position where we have to try to alter it further just to keep things going.
Yeah, and supposing that it won't have like unexpected consequences. I remember one of the.
That's very much part of the book.
Yeah. There was one example you gave about like one group of mice that the indigenous people of New Zealand brought to the island, and then it started eating the birds. But then the Europeans came and they brought their own kind of mice. Or I believe it was like the Norwegian rat.
Rats, yeah.
Yeah, and then their solution was like, all right, let's bring some cats. And then the cats started further eating those birds.
Yeah, no, it's, well, and in this new book, I do take up that issue again briefly, and people are looking, in this version, people are looking at, can we, now with CRISPR, can we gene edit rats? Could we even have a gene drive rat? You guys, I'm sure, all know what gene drive is, but for your audience, it's the idea that you would can do a form of gene editing where you can sort of guarantee that this trait, instead of being diluted as these animals mate with unedited organisms, the trait gets pushed out into the population. So could you engineer a gene drive rat which had some, let's say, only produced male offspring? That's one idea. And then you would, so that's called a suppression drive. And then, you could, theoretically drive the population to zero. And people are working on that. They haven't come up with a gene drive rat yet, but I do think it will be possible, in the not too distant future.
Those solutions to me are super scary, because people here in Caltech work on gene drives for mosquitoes, like to remove malaria and chikungunya and all these things. But evolution is something you don't want to mess with, and nature is always going to find a way, because I just don't know, it's like such a complex system with so little predictability that is, you think you know what you're doing and you actually didn't, and turns out that now rats, have like opposite thumbs and they can grab things or something.
Well, that's very much the theme of this new book. Yes, absolutely. I can't disagree with you. How's that? But there are, these problems admit of no easy solution at this point, and the question of what's the riskiest path and what's the least risky path becomes harder and harder to answer, I think.
Yeah, I started reading your new book, and it's striking how these solutions that we've come up with to counteract the disasters that we've created almost sound like sci-fi. Some of them, like these magnificent engineering works to, for instance, try to keep New Orleans and Louisiana from sinking anymore, and they just seem to keep contributing to the problem. And one thing that was striking the most for me was, I think you quoted someone that was like a general public person who said, I really don't like when humans come up with strategies to intervene further, because that usually ends up even worse. So it seems to me that there's very little credibility among like general people on what we're capable of doing back, because and also with introduction of species that we think are gonna improve the ecosystem or cause some benefit, even trying to control other species, like doing some biological control that we think, oh, this is gonna turn out well, and it doesn't turn out well at all. And
yeah, but it goes on and on. I mean, all of the stories in the book are in the, they're in the past. But I was just reading today, for example, here in the Northeast, we have a lot of ash trees. You probably heard of emerald ash borer killing all the ash trees in New England. And, it's an imported insect. And I was just reading today that, a lot of, a bunch of parasitic wasps have been brought over from Asia in the hopes that they will control the emerald ash borer. But right, what could go wrong, and the people who brought them over, would doubtless say, well, we did a lot of study, we're not making the same mistakes again. But as you were just saying, this ecosystem is extremely complicated. You can never anticipate everything that is going to happen. And when you move these things around, so there's a lot of question now whether, some of these insects that we've moved around to parasitize imported insects are actually now parasitizing native insects. The list goes on, and it never ends. But we're definitely always doing it. Sometimes consciously, a lot of times just because we're constantly moving shit around the world.
But then I guess we're left with the decision of, we don't take the risk because it's too difficult, or we do it and we live with the consequences. But either way, we're just like on a lose-lose situation, aren't we?
That's you pretty much summarized the new book. Yeah. not even having read it, you got right into the heart of the matter. Yeah. It's not. I don't think there are you know, I don't think, the time for simple, straightforward solutions, and even just saying, let's not do that anymore. Even that's not really viable. So we're not in a we're in a situation where everything is risky, and what's more risky is pretty hard to say, getting harder and harder to say.
Yeah, I wanted to, I wanted to ask you about the picture you have, like on the left. Is it a great oak?
Yeah, my great awe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. I like the story a lot because it's one of these examples where humans assume that God put all these animals for us, for us to sustain us. So in a way, we live in a world where we see nature as it belongs to us, instead of thinking that we all come from a same ancestor, from a single ancestor, right? From a common ancestor. So do you think sometimes that will change? Like, do we have any hope that people will look at nature in a more like compassionate way? Oh, what's missing here for that
Yeah.
to happen?
Well, I mean, I think that the one interesting thing about the Auk story, which is a really sad, one of the saddest stories in the book, in my view, is it seemed inexhaustible to people. I think they arrived in places where the great auks would nest. I mean, I think they were only really accessible to people during nesting season, and there were thousands and thousands of them, and it seemed like, how much damage could we do? But I think the one thing I guess I'd say is I think people are now realize that we're capable of driving almost anything to extinction, if we really put our minds to it. And so I do think that sense that nature is just so abundant, we can't make a dent in it. I do think that is something that people are now aware is not true. But are we? So I think most of the extinctions that we're causing even as we speak right now, they're generally, for the most part, not over hunting, over harvesting. They're more insidious, climate change and habitat destruction and pesticides and, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on and on. Introduced species are a huge driver. And those are even harder to combat, And then now I also do want to say, a certain amount of poaching is going on and is for some species is still very serious. But for most species, the problems are on some level ones that we may not even be conscious of. What is lurking in that shipping pallet that we're shipping around the world? That's a cause of a lot of unintentional damage.
I would like to emphasize that point because last night after the podcast, we got a lot of messages just quoting or repeating George Carlin, saying like, "Oh, it's just human arrogance to believe that we can do anything to nature. Nature is so vast." Like,
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I guess I'm wrong then. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that after reading your book, that we have a lot of evidence about like we can actually do some damage.
Yeah, you should tell them to read the book if they wrote that in. Yeah.
Definitely. So last night we had another friend that couldn't join us today, but he was telling us some like positive notes that you can see from time to time, like blue whales populations are increasing, and
Yes.
this species of tiger is getting better and stuff. Are those like significant? Are they eye candies? So should we feel hopeful, or because at the end of the day, worldwide fund, and all these things are like a multi-billion-dollar enterprise every year, and is it getting us somewhere, or are we just, instead of having the tiger disappear tomorrow, it's going to disappear in 20 years or something?
Well, I mean, here, since we wanted to end on a more hopeful note, I will offer a more hopeful note. And one thing I think our experience has shown, and I'll tell a hopeful story, and that is the story of the American eagle, which was really very highly threatened. You never saw an eagle here, in New England, when I was growing up because of DDT, which had the effect of, weakened their eggs, and so chicks were not viable. So you had really a big depression in American eagle population, and they banned DDT, and eagles are returning. If you take when I go to New York, I often take the train down the Hudson River, and you see these great eagle nests, and you see eagles. And that is a pretty new phenomenon. In the last 10 years, eagles are back. And so that's a huge success story. And what it shows is, if you can identify the stressor, if you know what it is, and you can get rid of it, then, nature is extremely resilient. That's why, we're all here. That's why the world is here. Things that are not resilient have not tended to survive. So, if we could if there are cases where we can identify the stressor and get rid of it, you can see amazing success stories. Now, the problem is that there are so many of these stressors, and so many of them we're not even aware of until it's too late, like the emerald ash borer. As I said, I was just reading this piece that certain species of ash are just so vulnerable to the emerald ash borer, they may go extinct. This is like one of the most common trees, in the northeastern US. So that just seems stunning to me, but it's true. So, both of those things are true at the same time. Nature is incredibly resilient. If we let it recover, it would recover. Can we do that and all continue to eat and all continue to live the way we do? That's the question.
That's the $1 million question.
Exactly.
the $1 trillion question.
Exactly. $64 trillion question. Exactly.
Oh God. I don't know. I guess I started reading also Bill Gates' new book, and I wonder. I don't know if you've seen it, but like what does he call himself? Like a hopeful technocrat, I guess. Like just thinking we're gonna come through this if we put our plans together. But there's like the human part of coming together in a scale that we have never seen before. Just to close this, because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, what is your vision of the future if you had to speculate here?
Well, I really do think that's the big question, whether, what increasingly people can see, and climate change is sort of something that people see as a direct threat to human society, which I don't think they see biodiversity loss in quite the same terms, fortunately or unfortunately. I guess mainly unfortunately. But so let's just take climate change. If there's sort of this looming threat, does that bring people together, on that sort of, World War II wartime footing? We can beat this, or, or COVID, we're going to, pump out this vaccine? Or does it divide the world, and, do we get increasing conflict as opposed to increasing cooperation? And honestly, if anyone, including Bill Gates, tells you they know the answer to that, press them on that, because I just don't think it's knowable at this point. So, but let's, I guess to end on an upbeat note, that's what we should all be, definitely working towards. So those young people who, want something to work towards, that's what we need to be working towards, a world where, which is going to be facing a lot of challenges on climate change. There's just no doubt about that. And there are different roads, two roads diverge in a yellow wood. There are different paths the world can take, and more people who are working for a, peaceful and just path versus a, unjust and conflict-ridden path, the better off we'll be.
I remember we started last night's broadcast going on like, all right, we're just gonna talk about science. This is not a politics broadcast. But the more we were talking about this issue, the more the solutions seemed to be like like collective action and organizing. So, is there a role of politics in saving the world?
Oh my God, absolutely. I mean, anything at the end of the day, including, the technologies that Bill Gates is talking about, anything, and I believe he would say the same thing, and I don't want to speak for him. All of these have political / policy underpinnings. They're not just going to magically happen,
Yeah, in the past elections, I was just amazed how Republicans campaign on this. Like, they want to take away our cows, or they think like they want to end fracking, things like that. So it seems to me like people, haven't, or the idea hasn't permeated to the general population. So I think education is like what is missing here fundamentally.
I think I can't answer that question. I think there's so many problems and competing for people's attention, from the basics of survival to, the big questions of our time and, varying from nation to nation. So I don't know the answer to that, but certainly, certainly there are a lot of people working to try to get the word out. And once again, I can only applaud that, and speaking to the young people in the audience can only, you don't have to make that your life's work, but you can still participate in that, even, if you're doing something totally different. So that's another thing to think about as people think about what they want to do with their lives. Your job and your vocation, they don't have to be exactly the same thing. You can, there are a lot of people out there organizing and doing political work who it's not their day job.
That is really interesting because I guess that's... Yep.
We're running out of time, and we don't want to take more minutes from Elizabeth. So
I do have to go literally in 1 minute. Yeah. So is there one more thing that we want to? Or should we end on that note?
Actually,
get out.
Whatever you want the public to live with, that would be great.
I think that last point, is maybe a good one to end on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think what you're doing is very important. And everyone who is listening, buy La Sexta Extinción, and the new book is coming out also in Spanish. So look forward to it. Thank you so much for your time, Elizabeth. This was amazing.
It was great to talk to you all.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.
And bueno, ahora sí ya podemos hablar en español. Muchas gracias, amigos, por haberle caído a esta transmisión. Los subtítulos de las transmisiones anteriores ya están ahí. Ahorita vamos a hacer un playlist para que puedan verlos. Ya aprendimos cómo poner subtítulos. Los subtítulos de esta conversación vendrán pronto. Y para tener más contexto al respecto, si quieren aprender un poco más del tema, ayer tuvimos una transmisión completamente en español acerca del libro de Elizabeth Kolbert. Y nada, nos vemos el próximo viernes para el podcast de mi gala. Muchas gracias, amigos. Por cierto, Kelvin Barrera decía... Entonces, ¿qué hacemos? ¿Podemos hacer algo? Ayer hablamos un poco más acerca del tema. Para más información, está el podcast de ayer. Y ya, nos vemos, amigos.
Busquen el libro de Elizabeth. Está en español. Creo que hoy en día nada más se puede comprar virtual. Ya no lo están imprimiendo. Pero vale la pena. Es un gran libro. Es una muy buena escritora. Entonces, La Sexta Extinción de Elizabeth Kolbert.
Premio Pulitzer.
¿Algo más que le quieran decir a la banda en esta bonita tarde de sábado?
Pues ya, ¿vamos por unas hamburguesas o qué? Sí.
Andas al McDonald's.
No, pues gracias a todos, estuvo chido, estuvo muy chido.
Sí, creo que es un libro bastante amigable, o sea, tal vez, bueno, ella no es una científica, pero el contenido ella se asesoró con científicos de talla mundial y es una escritora excelente. Entonces, hasta esta parte que ella estaba comentando de cómo toma todos estos datos y en vez de como presentártelos en datos crudos, con gráficas y cosas así que la gente no entiende mucho, es como más historias, como muy humanas, de ciertas especies que hemos ido extinguiendo, pero siempre teniendo en cuenta como el gran problema, ¿no? No solo esa especie, sino en general, ¿qué estamos haciendo? Lo que estamos haciendo de esta especie, lo estamos haciendo en un montón de otras especies. Entonces, Es un libro muy amigable de leer, creo que para cualquier persona. Entonces, sí, recomendadísimo.
Sale pues.
Bueno, ahí nos vemos. ¿Algo más que le quieran decir a la banda?
No, pues nada más ahí que lean, porque leer te abre mucho los ojos a estos tipos de situaciones. Y pues,
Y que aprendan inglés para que puedan acceder a más contenido y entender los podcasts antes de que salgan los subtítulos.
es exacto.
Ni pedo, banda. Es el lenguaje del imperio. ¿Qué le vamos a hacer?
Exacto. Aquí nos veremos para más transmisiones de ciencia.
Bueno, disfrutemos de la
Sobres.
naturaleza mientras dura. Se la lavan, amigos. Bye.
Bye.